Presentation. Congratulations for that fascinating talk and for your achievements at such a young age. It's really quite extraordinary. And there's some nice linkages to what I'm going to talk about, which is my book, which has just come out, called This Kingdom of Dust, which has a lot to say, perhaps not in a technical way, but in a metaphorical way, about the lunar regolith. So let me just start by, first of all, Wayne, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And I've only been a member of the Space Society since the beginning of this year. When this book came out, I've been doing various talks around the place. And when I was doing a presentation at the UTS, I ran into some people from the Space Society, and I thought, well, I'd love to be a member. So I joined, and I'm very glad that I did. I've been very interested in the presentations that I've been participating in and listening to. It's been great fun for me. I might just ask your indulgence. I'll just play this little, it only goes for a few seconds, promotional clip put together by my publishers, Penguin Random House, and it'll give you an idea of what my book is about. It imagines what would have happened had Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become trapped on the moon after a successful moonwalk, if their lunar module had not ascended again. And I was been a bit fascinated by that question, so I ended up writing this book. So let me just see if this video works. Very, very dramatic. I actually, this Kingdom of Dust is my second book. My first book was The Midnight Watch, which told the story of the Californian, which was the ship near the Titanic, and which saw the Titanic's distress rockets, but did not go to the rescue. I was obsessed with the Titanic. I mean, really obsessed with the Titanic as a child, and I ended up going to sea for a while as a ship's officer, and then I ended up becoming a lawyer at the very law firm that represented the Titanic back in 1912. And it was then that I decided I am going to figure out what happened on the Californian and why they did not go to the rescue. And my research for that book took me to London, to Boston, to New York, and eventually to the middle of the North Atlantic itself. On the anniversary of the sinking, it was quite an extraordinary event, and I feel like in the end I did come up with a satisfactory and quite extraordinary solution to the problem. It's all to do with the psychology of the people on board that ship. So if you're interested in that, the book is still available. Please, if you want to find out the answer to what happened on the Californian that night, I do recommend that book. But so how did I get from the North Atlantic to the moon? Well, it's an interesting story. I was thinking about what to write next, and a friend of mine visited from Tasmania. She came to Sydney and she had her son with her, and her son was texting. We were having dinner and he was texting a lot, and he was texting to his father, and he noticed me noticing him, and he apologized and he said, "I'm sorry, my father is feeling very needy. So he's contacting me by text all the time." And just jokingly, I said, "Well, you need to cut him off. You need to be cruel to be kind. Cut him off, just like Mission Control would have done to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin if the lunar module had not worked." And then a bit later in the dinner, after a few more glasses of wine, I thought, you know, that would make a really interesting novel. So I began my research. Although with my Titanic book, I could travel around the world and go to all of the places that book takes place in. Of course, I couldn't go to the moon. I couldn't walk on the moon, but I could certainly do the next best thing and meet some people who have walked on the moon. And here I am with Buzz Aldrin, who, of course, walked on the moon in Apollo 11. And there is Charlie Duke, who also walked on the moon, and Walter Cunningham, who was in Apollo 7. So this is one of the great honours of my life, to meet and speak to these men. This was in 2019 at the gala dinner, celebrating in California, in the Ronald Reagan Library and Museum, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 meeting. And the Apollo 11 landing, and meeting them was a great honor. And it was wonderful to hear them speak about what it was like to walk on the moon. And I couldn't help but think while they were talking about that, well, what would you have done? What would you have done if the lunar module had become stuck there? And of course, when I started my research, there's an enormous amount of material available about the Apollo missions, an enormous number of books and transcript of the missions and so on. So I started my research. One of the most interesting parts that I found was in the press conference that took place about 2 weeks before the mission. Here are Neil and Buzz. Mike was there too, of course, but he's just out of frame there. But they were inside a tent, positive pressure tent, so that no air could get into them, and they were facing questions from the world's media in the Manned Spacecraft Centre in their press room there. And the press conference goes on. It's quite boring, actually. They're asked all sorts of questions, but then there's this one question asked by a very polite British journalist who says, asks Neil, what would you do if the lunar module does not come up off the lunar surface? And I've always loved Neil's answer. I think only Neil could give an answer like this. He says, well, that's an unpleasant thing to think about. We've chosen not to think about that at the present time. And I thought, of all the people in the world, perhaps Neil is the only person who could choose not to think about something. He was as cool as a cucumber and a great hero of mine. But I thought about the things that Neil would not think about. I thought about what would have happened had the lunar module not worked. So in my book, it starts just as they've landed on the moon. It follows real history right up until the moment they go back inside the lunar module, and then they prepare to fly the lunar module back up to the command module, being orbited around the moon, being looked after by Mike Collins. And here is a picture of the very famous lunar module, and also a picture of the DSKY, or the computer keyboard on the Apollo guidance system. And you'll see a button there which I've circled in red. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it just says PRO, Pro, for proceed. And that's the button that Buzz would push after they've set themselves up for the takeoff. And that's the button which really had to work. There was no plan B here. If it didn't work, they were dead men. And in my presentations, as I've been giving presentations about this book, I've been saying to people, in a way, this is the most boring slide, this computer screen. But in another way, it's the most interesting, because behind that button lay life and death. There was no real opportunity for in-flight maintenance if it didn't work. Of course, there was no way they could be rescued. It just had to work. And they, if it didn't, they were dead men. So in my book, of course, the button doesn't work, and the whole adventure takes place from there. I really had to study hard. Of course, I've never been inside the lunar module. I'm no real expert in space. I had to really do a lot of research, but thank goodness there's a whole bunch of technical material there. And thank goodness for COVID lockdown as well. That they gave me a lot of opportunity to really do a deep dive into the LEM design. I studied piping diagrams. I studied manuals, instrument panels, checklists, the Apollo News reference press kits of the time. And I did a whole lot of mathematics as well to try to make sure that I got the technical details right. Because getting the engineering right was important, not just so that the novel has an authentic, what I call a techno texture, but to do good service to the lunar module, which is one of my favorite machines in all of history. In fact, I ended up, while I was writing this book, making a model of it. I don't know if I'll just lift it up here. It took me quite a long time. I don't know if you can I can't see myself here. I don't know if you can see that. Is that there's the lunar module. This model actually ended up being very helpful in my writing of the scenes which take place outside the lunar module, where they try to do various things to fix it. Anyway, by the end of my research, I really, to quote one of the characters in my novel, I really grew to love the lem. So the question is, I had to really come up with a plausible failure scenario. And this was quite difficult because it was a notoriously reliable spacecraft with lots of simplicity and inbuilt redundancy. So I had to try to figure out, well, what might have gone wrong with this craft on the moon? And the thing that was very helpful was a book by Tom Kelly, who was the lead designer of the lunar module. I have the book here. I don't know if that, oh, it's reversed, or it is on my screen anyway. It's called Lunar Module. So Tom Kelly from the Grumman Aerospace Company, he wrote this book about the lunar module. And from that book, I discovered that the thing that he was most worried about were the propellant tanks, the titanium propellant tanks. NASA, there was only one fuel tank and one oxidizer tank. NASA had sort of pushed him to try to have two of each for redundancy, but he couldn't get the weight calculations to work, so there was only one of each. And the titanium proved to be notoriously temperamental. Let me give you just two examples. As they were developing the lunar module, they progressively made the oxidizer more pure. The oxidizer was nitrogen tetroxide, but it had some impurities in it as well, for instance, nitrogen dioxide. And they progressively made the oxidizer more and more pure. But then they realized that actually the impurities were having a beneficial effect on the titanium tanks. So they had to depurify the oxidizer again. Another example was they'd stopped using, well, they started to reuse the cleaning pads, which they'd been used to clean the tanks, and microscopic traces of detergent were getting onto the tanks, and that was causing the tanks to fail. And the first lunar module that was delivered to NASA from Grumman, NASA hated it. It was so full of leaks, they called it a piece of garbage, and it did great damage to the reputation of Grumman and of Mr. Kelly. But he, of course, they solved all of these problems, and all of the lunar modules worked perfectly, as we know, in the subsequent Apollo missions. But during Apollo 11, Mr. Kelly and all the people at Grumman were most nervous about the tanks leaking. So, of course, in my book, that's what I make happen. There's a scene where Neil Armstrong, outside the lunar module, carrying out an inspection, discovers that the oxidizer tank is, in fact, empty. So, I mean, I love the lunar module, but I always knew that this book couldn't just be about moon machines. It's at its core, it's about people. And in particular, the main person that it's about is Joan Aldrin, who is the wife of Buzz Aldrin, and all of the things that she does in Houston during this crisis. I really grew to love Joan Aldrin. She's an extraordinary person. She had a master's degree from Columbia University. She was a TV actress. They even offered her in New York, they offered her a radio program. When she went to Houston with Buzz, they offered her own radio program, not about space, but about her own thing. She was very annoyed when Life magazine and NASA said, no, you can't do a radio program. And she said to Buzz, I want to get out of town because they won't let me do my radio program. But of course she didn't. She stayed, and she did her very best to be a dutiful astro wife. NASA said the wives always had to be as proud, thrilled, and happy as they could be. And so Joan did her best to do that. But, you know, in a way, she was trapped by the gender stereotypes of the time. The astro wives were in a way just as trapped by those stereotypes as the men were in the spacecraft, which on the moon. So in the end, Joan does a really extraordinary thing in this novel. She really plays the most important role. So that's an interesting thing. So look, do Neil and Buzz escape? Well, as Buzz keeps saying during my book, well, the maths is the maths and the engineering is the engineering. And without oxidizer, the fuel may as well be seawater. So it's pretty bleak. If there's no oxidizer, there was no escape. But when you're writing a book like this, you must always give the reader hope. And so I really thought, is there any possible way the lunar module could be got off the surface if it's got no main propulsion system oxidizer? And here I did a lot of study of flow diagrams, and here is the ascent propulsion flow diagram for the lunar module. And I've circled here the little thing which gave me a great idea, and it is the connection between the main propulsion system and the reaction control system. And the reaction control system has its own fuel, own oxidizer. So perhaps there's a way, after all, to use elements of the RCS to get off the ground. Does it work? Well, I can't tell you that. Please read it to find out. All I can say is that when I was figuring out how to end this novel, I followed the advice of Robert McKee, who wrote a famous book story for Hollywood scriptwriters, where he says you've got to give the audience what they want, but not in the way they expect it. I was very pleased that the review in the Daily Telegraph, the reviewer there said very positive things about the ending. In fact, she said, the ending of this book is everything. I was literally in tears as I read the final chapters, but if you think you know how it ends, think again. And the epilogue is a masterclass in endings. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an encouragement to read the book. If you do read it, I'm very proud of it. I hope it does a little bit to lift interest in space in Australia. If you do read it, I'd be very grateful, but I'd also love to hear any feedback you have about any of the technical things that I may have got wrong. I'm sure they are there. But anyway, thank you very much for your time. It's been great talking to you about my book. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, David. It's available on Kindle as well as paperback, isn't it? I think from our
Yes. All the usual ways, yeah. Kindle, definitely.
They can get electronic for those people who don't want to get the physical one as well. Because I think I remember seeing it on the Amazon website if you wanted to get the Kindle version.
Yeah, it's definitely available, Kindle.
Okay. Any other questions? I think
Wayne, that was fantastic.
it was certainly interesting. Sounds like David knows a lot about the lunar module after
I reckon.
which is and
I ended up with this folder. This is my tech docs folder.
Yeah.
It's thick.
The trivia was that the lunar module was running so far behind that they actually swapped Apollo 9 and 8 missions around in terms of the objectives. So that was part of the reason why 8 ended up doing what it was doing. Originally, they were supposed to do the Apollo 9 lunar tests in Earth orbit, but I'm afraid it wasn't ready.
No, it wasn't ready. I'm intrigued when I compare the lunar module to Elon Musk's proposed human landing system. The weight sensitivities of the lunar module were really quite something, and it seems like Elon Musk's SpaceX's idea is this enormous spacecraft landing on the moon. I'm just not quite sure how that's going to work.
Yes, the center of gravity is the big problem. I know Alan and myself have had a few conversations about that from an engineering perspective. So it's going to be wait and see what happens there. So anyway, thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it. That was
my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Good luck, David.